Good evening, and welcome back to another journey through the corridors of time. I'm Professor Somnus, and tonight we venture into one of America's most enduring mysteries, the lost colony of Roanoke. Close your eyes, turn the page, and let history guide you to sweet dreams. Tonight, we'll follow the trail of 115 English souls who vanished into the American wilderness over 4 centuries ago, leaving behind only questions, theories, and a single cryptic word carved into wood. But as we'll discover, perhaps they didn't vanish at all. Perhaps they simply transformed. Chapter 1. Sir Walter Raleigh's Vision. As the gentle rain falls around us tonight, let us drift back through the mists of time to the England of 1584. Picture, if you will, the court of Queen Elizabeth I, a world of silk and candlelight, of whispered ambitions and grand designs. It was here, in the halls of power, where tapestries depicted distant lands and unknown shores, that a dream was born. Sir Walter Raleigh, even his name carries the weight of adventure. A man of many talents, poet, courtier, explorer, but perhaps most importantly, a dreamer who gazed westward across the Atlantic and saw not an endless void, but endless possibility. The rain that falls tonight has fallen for centuries, just as it fell upon the cobblestones of London when Raleigh first presented his vision to the Virgin Queen. England in the 1580s was a nation on the cusp of greatness, yet surrounded by rivals. Spain's treasure fleets returned, heavy with gold from the Americas, their coffers swelling with wealth that England could only watch from afar. The Spanish had claimed vast territories, built cities, established trade routes that stretched across oceans. And here was England, a small island nation, wealthy in ambition, but poor in New World holdings. Raleigh understood what many of his contemporaries were only beginning to grasp, that the future belonged to those who could claim and hold territory across the sea, not merely for the gold and silver that seemed to flow so freely into Spanish hands, but for something perhaps more valuable, the chance to build anew, to create a society free from the ancient constraints of European feudalism. Listen to the rain and imagine Raleigh in his chambers, maps spread before him by flickering candlelight, the coastlines drawn by earlier explorers, Verrazano, Cartier, others who had sailed these waters and returned with tales of forests that stretched beyond the horizon, of rivers wider than any in England, of lands where a man might claim more territory than an English lord could inherit in a dozen lifetimes. But Raleigh's vision extended beyond mere territorial expansion. He spoke to Elizabeth of something grander, a Protestant foothold in the Catholic-dominated Americas, a place where English law and English customs could take root and flourish, a land where younger sons, those excluded from inheritance by England's primogeniture laws, might build their own estates, where craftsmen and farmers could work soil that had never known a feudal lord's claim. The Queen listened, as she always did, with the calculating mind of a monarch who had survived plots, invasions, and the constant pressure of European politics. Raleigh would not lead the expedition himself. His value to the crown kept him close to court. Instead, he would send his finest captains, his most trusted men, and eventually entire families willing to cross an ocean for the promise of a new beginning. The rain continues its ancient rhythm, just as it did when Raleigh's ships were being fitted out in English harbors, their holds slowly filling with the tools and supplies needed to carve civilization from wilderness. Iron implements, grain for planting, livestock, weapons, books, everything needed to transplant a piece of England to the far side of the world. But perhaps most importantly, Raleigh was gathering people, not just adventurers and fortune seekers, but families, men and women willing to bring their children across dangerous waters to build something permanent, something lasting. For this was to be no temporary trading post or military garrison, but a true colony, a place where English children would be born on American soil, where English traditions would take root in foreign ground. And as we listen to the rainfall tonight, we can almost hear the echo of that ancient ambition, the whisper of dreams that would soon set sail across the Atlantic, carrying with them hopes that would either flourish in the New World or vanish without a trace. Let us follow those dreams as they take shape, as vision becomes reality, and as history begins to unfold in ways that none of them could have imagined. Chapter 2. The Journey Across the Atlantic. The year was 1587, and as spring gave way to summer, 3 ships bobbed gently in the harbor at Portsmouth. The rain that had blessed England's green fields would soon be left behind for the vast uncertainty of the Atlantic. Listen to its rhythm tonight, and imagine how that same sound against wooden hulls must have seemed both familiar and farewell to the 115 souls preparing for their great adventure. They were not conquistadors or treasure hunters, these passengers. They were something far more precious and far more vulnerable. They were families. John White, the colony's governor and an artist by trade, had carefully selected each member of this small community. There were craftsmen whose calloused hands knew the secrets of carpentry and metalwork, farmers who understood the rhythms of planting and harvest, women who carried within them the knowledge of healing herbs and household management, and children. 17 women were with child when the ships departed, including White's own daughter, Eleanor Dare. Picture, if you will, the moment of departure. The creaking of rope and timber, the gentle lapping of waves against the hulls. Families gathered on deck for what they knew might be their final glimpse of England's shores, the white cliffs of Dover growing smaller, then disappearing entirely into the morning mist. Behind them lay everything they had ever known, familiar faces, ancestral homes, the graves of their fathers and mothers. Ahead lay only questions and hope. The crossing itself was a test of endurance that we can barely imagine in our age of swift travel. Week after week, the small flotilla pushed westward through waters that stretched beyond every horizon. The ships, likely no longer than a modern city bus, but narrower, became their entire world. Below deck, in spaces so cramped that grown men could not stand upright, families huddled together with their most precious possessions. Listen to the rain tonight and consider how different the sound of water must have been to those travelers. Not the gentle blessing it seems to us, but a constant reminder of the vast alien element that surrounded them. Rain on deck could provide fresh water for drinking and cooking, but storms brought terror. Waves that could snap masts, winds that could drive a ship far off course into regions no English chart had ever mapped. The children aboard those ships. Imagine their wonder and fear as the familiar rhythm of English village life gave way to this strange new existence. Days measured not by church bells or market schedules, but by the endless cycle of dawn and dusk over water. The youngest among them, those born during the voyage itself, would know only this floating world for the first months of their lives. And the women, particularly those carrying children, faced dangers that went beyond the ordinary perils of 16th century childbirth. Eleanor Dare, Governor White's daughter, was heavy with child when the ships departed. Week by week, as the vessels pushed deeper into unknown waters, her time approached. The ship's surgeon would have what medical knowledge existed in that age, but no hospital, no midwives experienced in difficult births, no familiar neighbors to offer comfort and assistance. For the men, each day brought new responsibilities. Ships required constant maintenance, sails to be mended, ropes to be spliced, pumps to be manned when the inevitable leaks developed. The mariners who guided the vessels had experience with these waters, but every league westward took them further from the familiar and deeper into the realm of speculation and hope. Food was carefully rationed: salt pork, hardtack, beer, the staples of long sea voyages. Fresh water was more precious than gold, collected when possible from rainfall and jealously guarded against waste or contamination. The smell of so many people living in such close quarters, the constant motion of the deck beneath their feet, the uncertainty of never knowing if tomorrow would bring fair winds or deadly storms. Yet through all these hardships, the dream persisted. In the quiet hours between watches, families must have spoken in hushed tones about the land awaiting them. Raleigh's earlier expeditions had brought back reports of vast forests, clear rivers, soil so rich that crops would grow without the back-breaking labor of clearing stones that characterized English farming. They spoke of friendly native peoples who might become trading partners, of harbors where ships could shelter, of a place where English law and English customs could take root and flourish. The crossing took nearly 2 months of hope and fear, of prayers offered up to a God who seemed to dwell somewhere beyond the endless horizon. 2 months of watching pregnant women grow heavier with children who would be born in the new world, of listening to elderly passengers speak of homes they would never see again, of young men and women who had gambled everything on Raleigh's vision. And then, one morning in late July, the cry came from the lookout: "Land ho!" The outer banks of what we now call North Carolina appeared like a miracle on the western horizon. Lo, sandy islands covered with unfamiliar vegetation, surrounded by waters of a blue-green shade they had never seen, the promised land at last. As we listen to the rain tonight, let us imagine that moment when those weary travelers first saw the shores of their new home. The relief, the gratitude, the sudden rush of possibility as months of ocean gave way to solid ground. But also, perhaps, a touch of fear. For this was no longer England, and they were no longer quite the same people who had departed Portsmouth all those weeks before. They had become something new during that crossing. Americans, though they did not yet know the word. Chapter 3: Building a Life in the Wilderness. The rain falls gently tonight, much as it must have fallen on those first mornings when the colonists of Roanoke awakened not to the familiar sounds of English villages, but to something entirely new. The whisper of wind through unfamiliar trees, the calls of birds they had never heard, the lap of strange tides against an alien shore. Roanoke Island itself was a modest piece of land, perhaps 12 miles long and 3 miles wide, nestled between the mainland and the barrier islands that stretched like protective fingers along the coast. As our weary travelers stepped from their boats onto this sandy soil, they must have felt both relief and overwhelming uncertainty. Here was solid ground after months at sea, but what manner of ground was this? The trees were familiar, yet different. Oaks and pines, yes, but growing in configurations unknown to English eyes. Cedars twisted by salt winds into shapes that seemed almost sculptural. Vines thick as a man's arm climbing toward canopies that filtered sunlight into patterns of green and gold. And everywhere the scent of growing things, rich earth, salt air, and something indefinably wild that spoke of a land that had never known plow or pasture. Governor John White, artist and leader both, must have walked among his charges with careful eyes, seeing not just the beauty of this place, but its possibilities and its challenges. Here, perhaps, they might build their homes, close enough to fresh water, elevated enough to avoid flooding, with sight lines to the sound where ships might approach. There, they could clear ground for gardens and grain fields. And always, the question that hung over every decision: where were the people who already called this land home? The Roanoke and Croatoan peoples had dwelt in these lands for generations beyond counting. They had watched earlier English expeditions come and go, had traded with some, fought with others, had learned to read the intentions of these pale strangers who arrived in great floating houses with billowing white wings. Some among them remembered the earlier colony, Raleigh's first attempt in 1585, and the tensions that had ultimately driven those settlers back to England. Picture those first encounters, tentative and careful on both sides. English families clutching their children closer as they glimpsed figures moving through the forest. Native observers watching from concealment as these newcomers began to unload strange possessions. Iron tools, livestock, household goods that spoke of an intention to stay. The careful dance of diplomacy that would determine whether this second attempt at English settlement would flourish or fail. Montejo, the Croatoan leader who had journeyed to England with earlier expeditions, served as interpreter and guide. Through his patient efforts, the barriers of language and custom began to lower, just slightly. Trade began. English metal goods and cloth for corn, tobacco, knowledge of local plants and animals. The colonists learned which berries were safe to eat, which roots could be ground into flour when grain ran short, where the best fishing could be found. But even as these fragile relationships developed, the enormous task of creating a settlement consumed every daylight hour. Trees had to be felled and shaped into timbers. The fort begun by the earlier expedition needed to be repaired and expanded. Houses, proper English houses, with stone foundations and wooden walls and thatched roofs, rose slowly from the sandy soil. Each structure represented countless hours of labor, families working together to create spaces that might, in time, feel like home. Eleanor Dare, Governor White's daughter, grew heavier with child as the summer progressed. On August 18, 1587, her labor began in a rough cabin that was still more shelter than home. With no experienced midwives, no physicians trained in the mysteries of childbirth, the women of the colony gathered around her as they had around countless mothers in countless English villages. And when her cries finally gave way to the thin wail of a newborn, Virginia Dare became the first English child born in the New World, a living symbol of the colony's hopes for permanence. Yet even as they celebrated this birth, the colonists faced growing concerns. Their supplies, carefully calculated for the crossing and the first months of settlement, were dwindling faster than expected. The corn they had hoped to obtain from native traders was not as plentiful as Raleigh's reports had suggested. Tools broke and could not be replaced. Clothes wore thin under the demands of constant outdoor labor. By late summer, the decision could no longer be avoided. Governor White would have to return to England for supplies, not the gradual resupply they had originally planned, but an emergency mission to prevent the colony from facing starvation. It was a choice that tore at every heart in the settlement. White would be leaving his daughter and granddaughter, his friends and neighbors, his responsibility as their leader, but without fresh supplies, without more colonists to share the burden of building this new world, the entire enterprise might collapse. The colonists made their plans with careful deliberation. If danger threatened in White's absence, if relations with neighboring tribes deteriorated, if Spanish forces appeared on the coast, if disease or disaster made their position untenable, they would not simply vanish. They would carve their destination into a tree or post, marking their path for White to follow when he returned. If they left under duress, they would add a cross to the message. It was a simple system, born of necessity and hope. And so, as autumn colors began to touch the trees of Roanoke Island, John White made his farewells. He embraced his daughter Eleanor and kissed his granddaughter, Virginia, just 3 weeks old, promising to return before winter with everything the colony needed to not just survive, but thrive. He carried with him detailed maps, careful notes about the land and its peoples, and samples of the plants and minerals that might one day make this venture profitable. The ship that bore him eastward also carried the colony's hopes, their messages to loved ones left behind in England, their urgent requests for tools and food and reinforcements. As it disappeared beyond the horizon, 115 English souls were left alone in the American wilderness, trusting in their own resourcefulness and their governor's promise to return. Listen to the rain tonight, and imagine how it must have sounded to those colonists during their first autumn on Roanoke Island. Was it a comforting reminder of English seasons, or a harbinger of the difficult winter ahead? Did they gather in their rough cabins and speak of home, or had this strange new land already begun to feel like home itself? As we shall see, Governor White's journey back to England would prove far longer and more difficult than anyone could have imagined, leaving those brave souls to face whatever challenges awaited them in the gathering darkness of their first American winter. But few as fraught with urgency and heartbreak as John White's voyage back to England in the autumn of 1587. Picture him standing at the stern of his ship, watching Roanoke Island shrink to a distant smudge on the horizon, knowing that somewhere in that wilderness his daughter Eleanor was caring for baby Virginia, that 114 souls were depending on his swift return with the supplies that would mean the difference between thriving and mere survival. White carried with him more than cargo manifests and supply requests. In his careful artist's hands were sketches of this new world, detailed drawings of the plants and animals his colonists had encountered, maps of the coastline and inland waterways, portraits of the native peoples who might become allies or enemies, depending on how skillfully future relations were managed. These images would serve as proof of the colony's progress, evidence to convince investors that Raleigh's vision was worth continued support. But even as White's ship pushed eastward through familiar waters, events beyond his control were reshaping the world he hoped to return to. Queen Elizabeth's England was preparing for war. Spanish ships massed in harbors across Europe, carrying King Philip's determination to crush the Protestant heretics who dared challenge Catholic dominion over the New World, the great enterprise of England. What history would remember as the Spanish Armada was taking shape with methodical, terrifying purpose. When White finally reached English shores in November of 1587, he found a nation mobilizing for survival. Every available ship was being pressed into naval service. Every experienced captain and crew was needed for the defense of the realm. The merchants and investors who might have funded a relief expedition to Roanoke were instead opening their purses to purchase cannons and powder, supplies for the ships that would stand between England and invasion. Imagine White's growing desperation as winter gave way to spring, and spring to summer, and still no ships could be spared for his colonists. He haunted the offices of London merchants, the halls where Raleigh's associates gathered, the taverns where sea captains drank and planned their voyages. Always the same answer. After the Spanish threat was dealt with, after Philip's grand fleet was defeated, then perhaps resources could be diverted to colonial ventures. But not now, not while England's very existence hung in the balance. The summer of 1588 brought the clash that would reshape European politics for generations. Spanish galleons, heavy with cannons and seasoned soldiers, sailed up the English Channel in formation so vast that witnesses described them as a floating city. English ships, smaller but swifter, harried them with hit-and-run tactics that turned the Channel waters into a confused maze of smoke and fire. And then the storms came, those same Atlantic gales that had challenged White's colonists, scattering the Armada's survivors along the rocky coasts of Scotland and Ireland. England had survived, but the victory came at enormous cost. Ships needed repair, crews needed rest, the royal treasury needed replenishment. Once again, White found his pleas for assistance met with sympathetic but empty promises. Perhaps next year, perhaps when the crisis had fully passed, perhaps when new investors could be found to replace those bankrupted by the war effort. The months stretched into years with agonizing slowness. 1588 became 1589, then 1590, and still White remained trapped in an England that had neither ships nor funds to spare for a handful of colonists on a distant island. He aged visibly during those years of waiting, his artist's hands growing gnarled with arthritis, his hair turning white with worry and frustration. In quiet moments, he must have wondered what was happening to his daughter, to his granddaughter, who would now be walking and speaking her first words, to the families who had trusted him to return swiftly with salvation. Letters arrived occasionally from Raleigh's other ventures, reports from privateering expeditions and trading voyages, but nothing from Roanoke Island. The silence was complete, absolute, as if the 115 colonists had simply vanished from the face of the earth. White clung to the reasonable explanations. They had moved inland for better farmland. They had relocated to a more defensible position. They had integrated with friendly native communities for mutual protection. The alternatives were too terrible to contemplate. Finally, in March of 1590, White's persistence was rewarded. John Watts, a London merchant with interests in privateering, agreed to include a stop at Roanoke Island as part of a larger expedition to the Caribbean. It was not the relief mission White had envisioned. No holds full of supplies. No new colonists eager to join the settlement. No royal backing or official support. Just a brief detour to check on the colony's welfare before continuing south to hunt Spanish treasure ships. But it was enough. After nearly 3 years of desperate waiting, White would finally return to his people. The ship that carried him westward in the spring of 1590 also carried his hopes, his fears, and his guilt at having been absent for so long. What would he find on Roanoke Island? Had the colonists survived the winters without adequate supplies? Had they thrived, building the permanent settlement of Raleigh's dreams? Had they been forced to flee, leaving behind only empty houses and broken dreams? As the familiar coastline of the Outer Banks appeared on the western horizon, White must have strained his eyes for any sign of life. Smoke from cooking fires, figures moving on the beach, boats putting out from shore to greet the returning ship. Instead, he saw only the eternal wilderness, green and beautiful and utterly silent. The boats that carried White and his companions toward Roanoke Island moved through waters that seemed untouched by human presence. No fishing nets, no canoes, no signs of the bustling activity that should have marked a thriving settlement. Only the lap of waves against sand, the cry of seabirds, and the whisper of wind through trees that had grown taller in his absence. Chapter 5. The Discovery of Silence. The rain falls softly tonight, as it may have fallen on that August morning in 1590, when John White stepped onto the sandy shore of Roanoke Island for the first time in 3 years. Picture that moment, the scrape of the boat's keel against sand, the splash of boots in shallow water, the terrible weight of silence where there should have been voices calling his name. The forest had begun to reclaim the clearings where gardens should have been flourishing. Vines had crept over structures that should have been maintained and expanded. The gates hung open, creaking softly in the morning breeze. White called out, his voice echoing strangely in the emptiness. "Hello, Eleanor, anyone?" But only the forest answered, with the rustle of leaves and the distant cry of a bird. Inside the fort, the silence grew even more oppressive. Houses stood empty, their doors ajar, their windows dark. Personal belongings were scattered about, as if the inhabitants had simply stepped away for a moment and never returned. A child's wooden toy lay abandoned in the dirt. Cooking pots sat cold and empty. Tools hung from pegs where working hands had placed them for the last time. White moved from house to house like a man in a terrible dream. Here was the cabin where his daughter Eleanor had given birth to Virginia, the first English child born in America. The rough wooden cradle still sat in the corner, empty now, lined with fabric that had faded from exposure to the elements. Had little Virginia taken her first steps across these very floorboards? Had she spoken her first words within these walls? Where was she now? The colonists' belongings told a story, but it was a story written in a language White could not fully understand. Heavy items had been left behind: iron pots, farming tools, pieces of furniture that would have been difficult to transport. But personal treasures were missing. No jewelry, no family Bibles, no small keepsakes that people carry when they must travel light, but cannot bear to leave everything behind. Most puzzling of all, there were no signs of violence, no broken doors, no hastily dug graves that might have marked the site of a final, desperate battle. Whatever had happened to the 115 colonists, it had not been sudden catastrophe or violent attack. White searched every structure, growing more desperate with each empty room. The church, where the colonists had gathered for worship, empty. The storehouse, where supplies should have been carefully rationed, empty. The workshop where craftsmen had shaped wood and metal into the tools of survival, empty. It was as if the entire community had simply evaporated like morning mist. But then, on the wooden post of the fort's main gate, White discovered something that made his heart leap with hope and dread in equal measure. Carved deep into the weathered wood, the letters stood out sharp and clear. Croatoan, Croatoan. This was the message they had agreed upon before his departure. If the colonists were forced to leave Roanoke Island, they would carve their destination for him to find. And Croatoan was no random wilderness. It was the island home of Mantio's people, the native allies who had helped the colonists learn to survive in this strange new world. The absence of a cross above the letters was equally significant. They had left not in distress, but by choice. Relief flooded through White as he traced the carved letters with his fingers. His colonists were alive. They had not been massacred or starved into extinction. They had simply moved, relocating to a place where survival might be easier, where native knowledge and English determination could combine into something stronger than either alone. But even as hope filled his heart, practical concerns began to crowd in. Croatoan Island lay some 50 miles south, past treacherous shoals and shifting sandbars that could trap unwary ships. The captain of White's vessel was already nervous about the approaching storm season, eager to complete this detour and continue south to the profitable business of hunting Spanish treasure ships. White pleaded with the ship's officers to attempt the journey to Croatoan, so close to answers, so close to reunion with his daughter and granddaughter. He could not bear to turn back now. But the sailors were experienced men who read the signs in wind and water. Storms were building to the east. The anchorage off Roanoke was becoming untenable. Delay could mean the loss of ship and crew. As White stood on the deck, watching Roanoke Island recede into the distance, he carried with him both hope and heartbreak. Hope, because the carved message suggested his colonists lived. Heartbreak, because once again he was leaving without them, carried away by circumstances beyond his control. The ship that bore White eastward across the Atlantic in the autumn of 1590 also carried the last confirmed sighting of the lost colony. Behind him, Roanoke Island returned to its eternal silence, keeping its secrets buried beneath the encroaching forest. The houses would eventually collapse, the clearings would disappear, and the very location of the settlement would fade from memory. But somewhere to the south, on Croatoan Island, or beyond, 115 English souls continued their American adventure. At least, that was what White chose to believe during the long voyage home, during the empty years that followed, during the nights when he lay awake, wondering what had become of his daughter and granddaughter and the families who had trusted him to return. Chapter 6. The Birth of a Legend. The rain that falls tonight has fallen on countless storytellers, countless fireside gatherings where the tale of the lost colony has been whispered, embellished, and passed down through the generations. Listen to its gentle rhythm and imagine how that same sound must have accompanied John White during his final years in England. As he grew old, knowing he would never again see his daughter or granddaughter, never learn the true fate of the families he had left behind, White returned to London in 1590 a changed man. The artist who had once sketched the wonders of the New World with careful, hopeful strokes now found his hands trembling as he tried to capture the memory of that empty fort, those silent houses, that single word carved into weathered wood. He petitioned investors, pleaded with ship captains, wrote letter after letter to anyone who might fund another expedition to Roanoke Island. But England's attention had turned to other matters: new wars, new opportunities, new dreams that did not require solving old mysteries. Sir Walter Raleigh, the architect of the colonial dream, gradually shifted his focus to other ventures. The costs of the failed Roanoke expeditions had strained even his considerable resources. Investors who had gambled on New World profits were reluctant to throw good money after bad, especially when Spanish treasure ships offered more immediate and certain returns. The missing colonists became an unfortunate footnote in Raleigh's larger story, a reminder that even the grandest visions could vanish into the American wilderness. As the years passed, the silence from Roanoke Island took on a weight of its own. No letters arrived reporting successful integration with native communities. No survivors appeared on other English ships to tell tales of their adventures. No native traders brought news of English families living among the Croatoan people. It was as if 115 human beings had simply stepped out of history itself, leaving behind only questions and that haunting word carved in wood. The mystery began to grow in the telling. Sailors in taverns spoke of ghost ships seen off the Outer Banks, phantom vessels crewed by the spirits of the lost colonists still searching for a way home. Fishermen reported strange lights on uninhabited islands, unexplained sounds carried on the wind from forests where no English foot had stepped for decades. Each retelling added new details, new possibilities, new terrors. By the early 1600s, when the successful colony at Jamestown finally took root in Virginia, the fate of Raleigh's settlers had become a cautionary tale told to new arrivals. The wilderness could swallow entire communities, the story warned. Preparation and vigilance were not enough. Even the most carefully planned settlement could vanish without trace, leaving only mysteries for future generations to puzzle over. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the growing legend was its impact on the families left behind in England. Eleanor White Dare had relatives who spent their entire lives wondering what had become of her. Little Virginia Dare, if she survived, would have grown to womanhood in the American wilderness, perhaps never knowing she had been born English, perhaps never learning that somewhere across the ocean, cousins and grandparents remembered her name and prayed for her safety. The Dare family name appears in English records for decades after the colony's disappearance, each entry a reminder of questions that would never be answered. Did these relatives dream of Eleanor in their final moments? Did they imagine Virginia as a young woman, perhaps married to a native warrior, perhaps living in a community that blended English and American ways? Did they picture her children, their own kin, running through forests that no Englishman had ever seen? As the 17th century progressed and English colonies began to dot the American coastline from Maine to Georgia, the mystery of Roanoke took on new dimensions. Settlers reported encounters with native peoples who possessed European features, who knew fragments of English words, who carried metal tools of obviously European manufacture. Could these be descendants of the lost colony? Had Raleigh's people not perished, but instead been absorbed into the indigenous communities of the region? Each rumor sparked new expeditions, new searches, new hopes for resolution. Traders ventured into the Carolina interior seeking tribes that might harbor English descendants. Missionaries learned native languages, partly in hope of discovering English words that had survived in indigenous dialects. Colonial governors commissioned surveys of remote regions where lost colony survivors might have established new settlements, but the wilderness kept its secrets. Every promising lead dissolved under closer examination. Every reported English descendant proved to have other origins. Every artifact that might have belonged to Raleigh's colonists could be explained by later trade or contact. The mystery deepened rather than resolved, becoming as much a part of America's landscape as the forests and rivers themselves. Writers began to weave the lost colony into the emerging mythology of America. Here was a story that captured something essential about the colonial experience: the courage required to leave everything familiar behind, the vulnerability of small communities surrounded by vast unknowns, the thin line between survival and disappearance that marked life on the frontier. The lost colony became a symbol of both American dreams and American nightmares, representing the price that might be paid for the audacity to build new worlds in ancient lands. And through it all, that single word continued to echo: Crotona. 7 letters carved into wood by unknown hands for unknown purposes. Was it a destination or a warning? A message of hope or a cry of despair? Had John White interpreted it correctly, or had some other meaning been intended? The word itself became a talisman, repeated by generations of mystery seekers and amateur historians who believed that somewhere in its syllables lay the key to one of America's greatest puzzles. Act 2. The Search for Truth. Chapter 7. Archaeology awakens the past. The rain falls tonight, as it has for centuries, washing the soil of the Outer Banks, slowly revealing and concealing the secrets buried beneath. But in our modern age, we no longer rely solely on legend and speculation to understand the past. We have learned to read the language written in pottery shards and post holes, in layers of earth and fragments of metal. The story of the lost colony is being rewritten, not in ink and imagination, but in the patient discoveries of archaeologists who have taught the very ground to speak. It was not until the 20th century that serious scientific investigation began to pierce the veil of mystery surrounding Roanoke Island. For over 300 years, the site of the original settlement had been left to time and weather, its exact location becoming as much a matter of debate as the fate of its inhabitants. Trees had grown where houses once stood. Storms had reshaped the coastline. The forest had reclaimed clearings that once bustled with the sounds of English voices and industry. But in 1937, the first systematic archaeological excavation began under the direction of J.C. Harrington. Picture those early investigators, armed with tools that seem primitive by today's standards, carefully scraping away centuries of accumulated soil. Each shovelful might contain fragments of a colonist's dinner plate. Each screen full of dirt might yield a button from a child's clothing, a nail from a carpenter's workshop, a bead that once adorned an English woman's dress. The work was painstaking, methodical, requiring the patience of monks and the precision of surgeons. Archaeology is not treasure hunting. It is the art of reading stories, written in the language of discarded objects and forgotten foundations. Every artifact must be precisely mapped, carefully preserved, exhaustively catalogued. The location where each fragment is found matters as much as the fragment itself, for context provides meaning that isolated objects cannot convey. As the decades passed and techniques improved, the archaeology of Roanoke Island began to yield remarkable discoveries. The fort's outline emerged from the earth like a ghostly blueprint, its defensive walls marked by the dark stains of rotted posts and the scattered remains of hardware. Within its boundaries, the foundations of houses appeared, rectangular patterns of darker soil where wooden sills had once rested, hearths marked by concentrations of ash and charcoal, refuse pits that had become time capsules, preserving the debris of daily life. But it was the smaller discoveries that proved most revealing. Fragments of pottery showed not just English manufacture, but also native techniques, suggesting trade, interaction, perhaps even shared meals between colonists and indigenous peoples. Copper ornaments bore the marks of European metalworking, but had been fashioned into forms favored by local native artisans. Iron tools showed signs of modification, adaptation to purposes their English makers had never envisioned. The picture that emerged was far more complex than the simple narrative of vanishing colonists. This was evidence of a community in transition, of English settlers learning to survive in an American environment, of cultural boundaries becoming blurred through necessity and proximity. The archaeological record spoke not of sudden abandonment, but of gradual adaptation. In the 1990s, new technologies revolutionized the search for answers. Ground-penetrating radar could detect buried foundations without disturbing the soil above them. Chemical analysis could identify the origins of metal objects with unprecedented precision. Digital mapping created three-dimensional models of the site that revealed patterns invisible to earlier investigators. Dr. Nicholas Luckety and his team at the First Colony Foundation brought these modern techniques to bear on the Roanoke mystery. Their work uncovered evidence that challenged long-held assumptions about the colony's fate, rather than a single catastrophic abandonment. The archaeological evidence suggested a more gradual process, perhaps multiple departures over several years, perhaps a planned relocation rather than a desperate flight. Most intriguingly, the excavations revealed that the colonists had been far more successful at establishing themselves than traditional accounts suggested. Their workshops had produced goods, their gardens had yielded crops, their relationships with native communities had evolved beyond simple trade to something approaching integration. This was not a failing settlement clinging to survival, but a community that had learned to thrive in its new environment. The search expanded beyond Roanoke Island itself. If the colonists had indeed relocated to Croton Island, as John White believed, then evidence of their presence should exist there as well. Teams of archaeologists began systematic surveys of Hatteras Island, the modern name for the place the colonists had called Croton. What they found there was even more remarkable. European artifacts dating to the late 16th century appeared in native village sites, not scattered randomly as trade goods might be, but integrated into the daily life of indigenous communities. Copper rings fashioned in European styles, iron tools modified for native purposes, fragments of pottery that showed both English and indigenous techniques in their manufacture. But perhaps most significant were the discoveries that suggested not just contact between English and native peoples, but genuine cultural fusion. Artifacts that combined European materials with native designs, hearths that showed cooking techniques borrowed from both traditions, burial practices that blended English Christian customs with indigenous spiritual beliefs. The rain continues its ancient rhythm tonight, just as it fell on those patient archaeologists as they carefully brushed dirt from fragments that had waited centuries to tell their stories. Each discovery added new complexity to our understanding of what happened to the lost colony. They had not simply vanished. They had not been massacred or starved into extinction. Instead, they appeared to have done something far more remarkable. They had adapted, evolved, become something entirely new. Act 2. The Search for Truth. Chapter 8. Voices from the Earth. The rain falls gently tonight, drumming against the windows as it has drummed against the earth for countless seasons, slowly revealing secrets that have waited centuries to be discovered. In laboratories across the country, scientists peer through microscopes at fragments no larger than a fingernail, fragments that carry within them the DNA of mystery, the chemical signatures of a story that refused to die. The breakthrough came not from the grand excavations that capture headlines, but from the patient work of specialists who have learned to read the invisible histories written in soil and bone, in pollen and trace metals. Dr. Mark Horton of the University of Bristol brought new scientific techniques to the Outer Banks in the early 2000s, techniques that could extract information from the very atoms that composed artifacts buried for 4 centuries. Imagine the moment when those first test results emerged from the laboratory computers. Copper artifacts found on Hatteras Island showed isotope signatures matching copper mines in Devon, England, the same region where many of Raleigh's colonists had originated. But more remarkably, the copper had been worked and reworked multiple times, showing tool marks that spoke of years of use, adaptation, modification for purposes the original makers had never intended. The pottery fragments told an even more fascinating story. Chemical analysis revealed clay sources from multiple locations, some from the banks of English rivers, some from Carolina creek beds, but others from sources that existed somewhere in between. Not geographically between, but culturally between. These were vessels that had been made by hands that knew both English and indigenous techniques, crafted by potters who were creating something entirely new from the marriage of 2 traditions. But perhaps the most extraordinary discoveries came from the application of environmental archaeology. Scientists began studying pollen preserved in ancient soil layers, reading the story of how the landscape itself had changed during the colonial period. What they found challenged everything historians thought they knew about the colonists' relationship with their environment. The pollen record showed dramatic changes in local vegetation patterns beginning in the late 1580s. Native plants that had dominated the region for centuries began to give way to European species, not just the expected crops like wheat and barley, but dozens of plants that had arrived as seeds in colonists' belongings, in the fur of livestock, in the folds of clothing. Plantain, dandelion, clover, plants that indigenous peoples would later call white man's footprints, because they sprouted wherever Europeans had walked. But the truly remarkable discovery was that these European plants had not simply displaced native species. Instead, the pollen showed evidence of deliberate cultivation, careful management that suggested someone with knowledge of both European and indigenous agricultural techniques was tending gardens that combined crops from 2 continents. Corn grew alongside wheat. Native medicinal herbs flourished next to European healing plants. This was not the agriculture of desperate survivors, but of skilled farmers creating something unprecedented. The search for genetic evidence led scientists to examine indigenous communities throughout the Carolinas, looking for DNA markers that might indicate European ancestry dating to the colonial period. The results were tantalizing but complex. Several communities showed genetic signatures consistent with 16th century English origins, but the patterns were not what researchers expected from a simple mixing of two populations. Instead, the genetic evidence suggested multiple generations of careful integration, intermarriage guided by cultural practices that ensured the survival of both traditions. Children who carried English genes but spoke indigenous languages. Adults who possessed native knowledge but retained fragments of European customs. Entire communities that had become living bridges between two worlds. Dr. Roberta Estes, a genetic genealogist specializing in Native American DNA, discovered something even more intriguing. Mitochondrial DNA, passed down through the maternal line. .com showed European markers in several indigenous families, dating to the appropriate time period. But nuclear DNA revealed a more complex pattern, suggesting that integration had been a gradual process spanning several generations, rather than a single moment of cultural merger. The implications were staggering. The lost colony had not vanished in a moment of crisis or catastrophe. Instead, they appeared to have achieved something that colonial administrators and European theorists had only dreamed of. Successful, sustained integration with indigenous peoples that preserved the best of both cultures while creating something entirely new. Archaeological evidence from inland sites began to support this theory. Excavations at native villages along the Chowan and Roanoke rivers revealed European artifacts dating to the late 16th century, but these were not random trade goods. They were tools that had been modified for specific purposes, household items that showed signs of long use and careful maintenance, personal ornaments that blended European materials with indigenous designs. Most significantly, these inland sites showed evidence of new architectural techniques, houses that combined English timber framing with indigenous building methods, storage facilities that used European carpentry to improve native preservation techniques, workshops where iron tools were maintained and modified using techniques that no single cultural tradition could have provided. The picture that emerged from these scientific investigations was revolutionary. The lost colony had not failed. They had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. But their success had required a transformation so complete that they had become invisible to European eyes, unrecognizable to the categories and expectations of their own time. Tree ring analysis of wooden artifacts provided the final piece of the puzzle. Growth patterns showed that European-style buildings continued to be constructed and maintained well into the 1600s, decades after the colony's supposed disappearance. But these structures incorporated native materials and techniques in ways that suggested their builders possessed knowledge from both traditions. The rain that falls tonight has witnessed this entire transformation. From the first tentative meetings between English colonists and indigenous peoples to the gradual emergence of communities that belonged fully to neither world and completely to both. Science has given us tools that the original investigators could never have imagined, tools that can read the stories written in atoms and molecules, in genes and pollen grains. Act 2, The Search for Truth. Chapter 9, The Croatoan Connection. The rain falls tonight as it has fallen for centuries on Hatteras Island, that long finger of sand and forest that the colonists knew as Croatoan. Listen to its rhythm and imagine how it must have sounded to English ears, gradually learning to call this place home. To children born between two worlds who would grow up knowing no other sound as the voice of their native land. The word Croatoan, carved into that wooden post, was not just a destination, it was an invitation. Modern research has revealed that Manteo, the Croatoan leader who had journeyed to England with earlier expeditions, had been far more than a simple guide or interpreter. He was a visionary who understood that the survival of both his people and the English colonists might depend on something unprecedented in the history of European colonization, genuine partnership rather than conquest. Archaeological work on Hatteras Island has uncovered evidence of what may be the most successful example of cultural integration in early American history. The Croatoan village sites from the late 16th century show a remarkable blending of architectural styles, with traditional indigenous longhouses modified to incorporate European timber framing techniques. These were not hastily constructed refugee shelters, but carefully planned buildings that combined the best features of both traditions. Dr. Mark Horton's excavations revealed workshops where European iron tools were maintained and modified using indigenous metalworking techniques that had been adapted for unfamiliar materials. Forge sites showed evidence of experimental alloys, attempts to combine European iron with local copper to create tools better suited to the Carolina environment. This was not merely trade or temporary cooperation, but genuine technological collaboration. The pottery found at these sites tells an even more remarkable story. Vessels that show clear European influence in their glazing and decoration, but were shaped using indigenous coiling techniques that produced stronger, more durable containers. Chemical analysis reveals clay sources from multiple regions, suggesting potters who traveled freely between English and Croatoan communities, sharing knowledge and creating hybrid forms that belonged fully to neither tradition yet served both perfectly. But perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from the middens, the refuse heaps that preserve the debris of daily life. These archaeological time capsules reveal meals that combined English cooking techniques with indigenous ingredients, European grains prepared using native methods, local seafood seasoned with herbs that had arrived in colonists' garden seeds. This was not the food of desperate survivors, but of communities that had learned to thrive by embracing the best of both worlds. The linguistic evidence is equally fascinating. When early European explorers of the 17th and 18th centuries encountered Croatoan descendants, they reported hearing English words woven seamlessly into indigenous languages. Not broken pidgin or awkward translation, but genuine bilingual fluency that had evolved over generations. Children who grew up switching effortlessly between languages. Adults who could negotiate equally well in English trading posts and indigenous councils. Personal names, recorded in these later encounters, show the same pattern of integration. English given names paired with indigenous surnames, or vice versa. Children named for English grandparents they had never met alongside siblings, bearing names that honored Croatoan ancestors. Family structures that honored both patrilineal English traditions and matrilineal indigenous customs, creating kinship networks that spanned cultural boundaries. The genetic evidence supports this picture of gradual, sustained integration. DNA analysis of modern descendants reveals European markers that date to the appropriate time period. But the distribution patterns suggest not a single moment of mixing, but generations of intermarriage, guided by careful cultural protocols. Families that preserved both English surnames and indigenous clan affiliations, lineages that carried forward the best traditions of both peoples. Religious practices show the same remarkable synthesis. Archaeological evidence suggests burial customs that combined Christian symbolism with indigenous spiritual traditions. Grave goods that included both European religious artifacts and traditional Croatoan ceremonial objects. Cemetery layouts that honored both English customs of individual graves and indigenous practices of community burial grounds. The agricultural evidence is perhaps most telling of all. Pollen analysis shows the systematic cultivation of European crops using indigenous growing techniques, but also the deliberate preservation of native plant varieties that might have been lost to European agricultural methods. Gardens that produced English vegetables alongside traditional Croatoan medicinal plants. Orchards where European fruit trees grew in carefully maintained groves that followed indigenous forestry practices. This was not cultural conquest or simple adoption, but genuine synthesis, the creation of something entirely new from the marriage of two traditions. The English colonists had not been absorbed into Croatoan society, nor had they imposed their customs on their indigenous neighbors. Instead, they had created communities that transcended the boundaries of both worlds. The evidence suggests that by the early 1600s, there were settlements throughout the Carolina coastal region, where English and Croatoan peoples lived as genuine neighbors, where children grew up equally fluent in both cultures, where innovations in agriculture, technology, and social organization drew freely from both traditions. These communities were neither fully English nor fully indigenous to it. They were genuinely American in a way that would not be seen again for centuries. Trade networks connected these hybrid communities to both English colonial settlements and indigenous tribal confederations. Archaeological evidence shows European goods flowing inland through traditional indigenous trade routes, while native products reached English markets through colonists who understood both systems of exchange. The Croatoan connection had become a bridge between worlds, facilitating commerce and communication that benefited all parties. The weather patterns recorded in tree rings suggest that the colonists had learned indigenous methods of predicting and preparing for seasonal changes. Their agricultural practices show adaptation to local climate cycles that European farming techniques could never have managed. They had become natives in the truest sense, people whose survival depended on intimate knowledge of their environment. Act 2. The Search for Truth. Chapter 10. The Gray-Eyed Natives. The rain falls tonight as it fell on that remarkable morning in 1709 when John Lawson, surveyor and natural historian, encountered something that would challenge everything the colonial world thought it knew about the fate of the lost colony. Picture him traveling through the Carolina interior, his quill poised to record the wonders of this still mysterious land, when he came upon a village unlike any he had ever seen. The people who greeted Lawson possessed features that defied easy categorization. Their skin bore the bronze of generations spent under the American sun, yet their eyes held colors that seemed borrowed from English skies, gray, blue, hazel shades that had never appeared in indigenous populations before European contact. Their hair, while dark, showed textures and wave patterns that spoke of mixed heritage. And when they spoke, English words flowed as naturally as their native tongue, not as a learned foreign language, but as a birthright passed down through generations. Lawson was a careful observer, trained in the scientific methods of his age. He recorded not just physical appearances, but cultural practices that seemed to blend traditions in ways that suggested deep, sustained integration rather than recent contact. Houses that combined indigenous building techniques with European architectural principles. Agricultural methods that produced both native and European crops using cultivation practices that belonged fully to neither tradition. Most remarkably, these communities possessed written records, not the formal documents of European administration, but family histories preserved in a unique script that combined English letters with indigenous pictographic symbols. Children learned to read and write in this hybrid system as naturally as they learned to speak their blended languages. These were not recently acculturated peoples struggling to adapt to European ways. but communities that had evolved their own distinct identity over multiple generations. The gray-eyed natives, as later observers would call them, possessed knowledge that could only have come from sustained contact with English colonists. They knew European herbal medicine alongside traditional indigenous healing practices. They crafted metal tools using techniques that combined English blacksmithing with indigenous metallurgy. They told stories that wove together English folklore with native oral traditions, creating new myths that belonged to their unique heritage. But perhaps most compelling were their family traditions. Lawson recorded genealogies that traced lineages back to English colonists who had arrived in the 1580s. Family stories that preserved names, dates, and details that matched historical records of Raleigh's expeditions. These were not vague legends or adopted tales, but specific family histories that had been carefully maintained across generations. The names themselves told a remarkable story. Surnames that clearly derived from English colonists, Dare, Cooper, Burden, Stevens, preserved in communities that had maintained their indigenous cultural identity while incorporating European heritage. Children who bore English first names alongside traditional indigenous names, reflecting parents who honored both sides of their ancestry. As European settlements expanded throughout the Carolinas during the 18th century, encounters with these mixed communities became more frequent. Traders reported entire villages where blue-eyed children played alongside their dark-eyed cousins, where families gathered for meals that combined European cooking methods with indigenous ingredients, where religious ceremonies blended Christian symbolism with traditional spiritual practices. The linguistic evidence was equally compelling. Missionaries attempting to learn indigenous languages encountered dialects that had incorporated hundreds of English words, but not as recent borrowings or trade terms. These English elements had been so thoroughly integrated into the grammatical structure of indigenous languages that they appeared to have been present for generations, evolving naturally as the languages themselves evolved. Dr. Stephen B. Weeks, writing in the early 1900s, documented dozens of families throughout eastern North Carolina who claimed descent from the lost colony. Their oral traditions preserved remarkably consistent accounts of English ancestors who had integrated with Croatoan communities in the late 1500s. Stories that included specific details about the original colonists that had never appeared in published historical accounts. The physical evidence supported these genealogical claims. Anthropological studies conducted in the early 20th century documented facial features, hair textures, and eye colors in these communities that suggested significant European ancestry dating to the appropriate time period. But more importantly, these physical traits appeared alongside cultural practices that had clearly evolved from indigenous traditions, suggesting integration rather than replacement. Archaeological excavations at sites associated with these communities revealed material culture that told the same story. European artifacts that showed generations of use and modification. Indigenous pottery that incorporated European decorative techniques. Metal tools that had been repaired and adapted using methods that combined both traditions. These were not museum pieces or ceremonial objects, but everyday items that had been part of living communities for decades. The agricultural practices of these mixed communities showed the same pattern of synthesis. Fields where European grains grew alongside indigenous crops, but planted and tended using techniques that belonged to neither tradition alone. Orchards where European fruit trees had been grafted onto native rootstock, creating varieties that could thrive in the Carolina climate while producing familiar fruits. Most remarkably, These communities had developed their own unique forms of governance that blended English common law with indigenous council traditions. Legal systems that recognized both individual property rights and communal land use. Decision-making processes that combined European majority rule with indigenous consensus building. Marriage customs that honored both Christian sacraments and traditional indigenous ceremonies. The gray-eyed natives represented something unprecedented in the history of European colonization. Successful, sustained cultural synthesis that preserved the best of both traditions while creating something entirely new. They were living proof that the lost colony had not vanished in catastrophe or failure, but had achieved the ultimate colonial dream. They had become genuinely American. Trade records from the 18th century show these communities serving as intermediaries between European settlements and indigenous tribes. Their unique cultural position allowing them to facilitate commerce and communication that would have been impossible for either group alone. They understood European commercial practices while maintaining the kinship networks that governed indigenous trade. They could read European contracts while honoring the verbal agreements that bound indigenous communities. Act 3. The Truth Revealed. Chapter 11. A New Understanding. The rain falls tonight as it has fallen for centuries, washing away old certainties and revealing new truths buried beneath layers of assumption and legend. We have followed the trail of evidence from John White's desperate search to the patient work of modern archaeologists, from whispered tales of gray-eyed natives to the precise measurements of genetic analysis. Now, as the pieces of this ancient puzzle align, we can see the lost colony not as a mystery of disappearance, but as a story of the most remarkable transformation in early American history. The colonists of Roanoke did not vanish into the wilderness. They became the wilderness. They achieved something that European colonial theory had never imagined possible. Complete cultural synthesis that preserved the essential elements of both traditions while creating something entirely new. They became the first Americans, in the truest sense of the word, people whose identity transcended the boundaries of the old world to embrace something uniquely suited to the new. Consider the magnitude of what they accomplished. In an age when European colonization typically meant the displacement or destruction of indigenous peoples, the Roanoke colonists chose a different path. They recognized that survival in this new world required not just adaptation, but transformation. They understood that the land itself demanded citizens who could honor both the knowledge brought across the ocean and the wisdom that had flourished here for millennia. The evidence we have examined reveals a process of integration so complete that it challenged the very categories their contemporaries used to understand the world. These were not English colonists who had learned indigenous skills, nor were they native peoples who had adopted European customs. They had become something unprecedented, communities that drew their strength from the marriage of two great traditions, families that carried forward the best of both worlds. The children born in these communities grew up as native speakers of languages that had never existed before, tongues that wove English vocabulary through indigenous grammatical structures, creating new forms of expression perfectly suited to their unique experience. They learned to read European texts while mastering the oral traditions that preserved indigenous knowledge. They understood Christian theology while participating in spiritual practices that honored the sacred relationships between people and land. Their agricultural innovations would have amazed both their European ancestors and their indigenous neighbors. Fields where traditional Three Sisters plantings of corn, beans, and squash grew alongside European grains, but tended using techniques that combined the best insights of both traditions. Orchards where European fruit varieties had been adapted to local conditions through careful grafting and selection. Gardens where medicinal herbs from two continents grew side by side, creating pharmacologies that neither tradition could have achieved alone. The material culture of these hybrid communities tells the same story of creative synthesis. Pottery that combined the durability of indigenous techniques with the aesthetic preferences learned from European traditions. Tools that merge the metallurgical knowledge of English craftsmen with the practical innovations of indigenous toolmakers. Buildings that protected families using architectural principles drawn from both worlds, creating homes perfectly suited to the Carolina climate and landscape. Most remarkably, these communities developed social structures that honored both individual achievement and collective responsibility. Governance systems that recognized personal property rights while maintaining communal land use practices. Marriage customs that celebrated both Christian sacraments and indigenous ceremonies. Child-rearing practices that prepared young people to succeed in both European and indigenous contexts. The economic innovations were equally impressive. Trade networks that connected European colonial markets with indigenous commercial systems, facilitated by people who understood both. Agricultural surplus that fed both growing European settlements and traditional indigenous communities. Craft production that created goods valued in multiple cultural contexts, generating prosperity for families that belonged fully to neither world yet served both perfectly. The religious synthesis achieved by these communities represents perhaps their greatest accomplishment. They created spiritual practices that honored both Christian revelation and indigenous wisdom, recognizing that different landscapes might require different approaches to the sacred. Their ceremonies combined European liturgical traditions with indigenous seasonal celebrations. Their moral systems drew from both biblical teachings and traditional indigenous ethics. This was not syncretism born of confusion or compromise, but genuine synthesis that recognized the complementary strengths of both traditions. They understood that Christianity's emphasis on individual salvation could be enriched by indigenous teachings about collective responsibility. They recognized that indigenous respect for natural cycles could deepen Christian appreciation for divine creation. The genetic legacy of these remarkable communities can still be traced in modern populations throughout eastern North Carolina. DNA analysis reveals European markers that date to the appropriate time period, but distributed in patterns that suggest sustained integration rather than simple mixing. Families that have maintained both English surnames and indigenous clan affiliations for over 4 centuries. Lineages that carry forward the living memory of successful cultural synthesis. Their linguistic innovations survived as well. Dialects throughout the region preserve English words that entered indigenous languages during the colonial period, but evolved naturally as part of living tongues rather than remaining as foreign borrowings. Place names that combine European and indigenous elements, creating a geography that honors both traditions while belonging fully to neither. The rain that falls tonight connects us to those remarkable people who chose transformation over preservation, who understood that survival in a new world might require becoming new people. They faced the ultimate test of colonial life, the choice between maintaining familiar ways that might prove inadequate to new challenges, or embracing change so complete that it would make them unrecognizable to their own past. Act 3. The Truth Revealed. Chapter 12. The rain falls tonight on a land that still carries the legacy of those remarkable souls who chose transformation over disappearance, synthesis over separation. As we reach the end of our journey through time, we can see that the story of the lost colony is not one of failure or tragedy, but of the most profound success, the creation of something genuinely new in human experience. The descendants of Raleigh's colonists walk among us still, though they bear little resemblance to the English families who departed Portsmouth in 1587. They are the Lumbee people of North Carolina, communities that have maintained their unique identity for over 4 centuries while contributing immeasurably to the fabric of American life. They are families throughout the coastal Carolinas whose oral traditions preserve memories of English ancestors alongside indigenous heritage, whose very existence challenges our neat categories of ethnicity and belonging. Modern genetic studies have confirmed what family stories preserved for generations, that significant numbers of people throughout eastern North Carolina carry European DNA markers dating to the late 16th century. Markers that exist alongside indigenous genetic heritage in patterns that speak of sustained integration rather than recent mixing. These are not historical curiosities, but living proof that the lost colony achieved something unprecedented in the annals of European colonization. The cultural innovations pioneered by these hybrid communities influenced the development of American society in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. Their agricultural techniques, combining European crops with indigenous growing methods, helped feed the expanding colonial population while preserving traditional ecological knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. Their linguistic innovations contributed to the development of distinctly American dialects that drew from multiple traditions. Their religious synthesis influenced the development of American Christianity, particularly in rural areas where indigenous spiritual practices blended seamlessly with European theological traditions. Their governance innovations, combining individual rights with collective responsibility, prefigured democratic ideals that would later become central to American political thought. Their economic systems, facilitating trade between different cultural groups, helped create the commercial networks that sustained colonial expansion. But perhaps their greatest contribution was simply proving that such synthesis was possible. In an age when cultural contact typically meant conquest or conversion, the descendants of the lost colony demonstrated that different peoples could maintain their distinctive identities while creating something entirely new together. They became living examples of what America could become, not a melting pot that erased differences, but a genuine fusion that honored all traditions while transcending the limitations of any single heritage. The archaeological record continues to yield new insights into their remarkable achievements. Excavations throughout the coastal Carolinas reveal settlements that combined architectural traditions in ways that created buildings perfectly suited to local conditions, while honoring both European and indigenous aesthetic preferences. Tool assemblages that show continuous innovation, with each generation building on the technological knowledge of their predecessors while adapting to changing needs and opportunities. Environmental evidence shows that these communities developed sustainable land use practices that supported growing populations while maintaining ecological balance. Their forest management techniques combined indigenous fire practices with European silviculture to create woodland systems that provided timber, game, and agricultural space without depleting natural resources. Their fisheries management preserved productive coastal waters while supporting both subsistence and commercial activities. The educational traditions they developed produced some of early America's most remarkable individuals, people who could navigate equally well in indigenous councils and European courts, who could read and write in multiple languages while maintaining oral traditions that preserved knowledge from both sides of their heritage. They became natural diplomats, traders, and cultural interpreters who facilitated peaceful relations between groups that might otherwise have remained enemies. Their artistic achievements blended aesthetic traditions in ways that created entirely new forms of expression. Pottery, that combined indigenous techniques with European decorative motifs, textiles that wove together traditional patterns with imported materials, music that merged English ballad traditions with indigenous ceremonial songs, creating new forms that expressed their unique experience of living between worlds. The medical knowledge they preserved and developed combined European herbal traditions with indigenous pharmacology, creating healing practices that drew from both traditions while developing new applications suited to local conditions. They became the healers for diverse communities, trusted by both European settlers and indigenous peoples who recognized their unique qualifications. As European settlements expanded throughout the Carolinas and beyond, descendants of the lost colony served as guides, interpreters, and cultural bridges. They possessed knowledge of inland regions that no pure European could have acquired, while understanding European needs and customs in ways that purely indigenous guides could not match. They made possible much of the peaceful expansion that characterized early settlement in the region. Their story reminds us that American identity has always been more complex and fluid than our official histories suggest. Long before the Founding Fathers debated the nature of American citizenship, the descendants of the lost colony were living as genuinely American people, shaped by this continent's landscapes and opportunities, drawing strength from multiple cultural traditions, creating new ways of being human that honored both indigenous wisdom and European innovations. Today, as we struggle with questions of identity, belonging, and cultural synthesis in an increasingly connected world, their example offers both inspiration and guidance. They prove that people from radically different backgrounds can not only coexist but create something together that is stronger and more beautiful than what either could achieve alone. They demonstrated that survival sometimes requires not just adaptation but transformation so complete that we become new people, citizens of new worlds that exist only because we were brave enough to imagine them. And so we reach the end of our journey through the mists of Roanoke's mystery. We've walked with archaeologists as they carefully brush away centuries of soil, revealing pottery shards that whisper of survival rather than tragedy. We've seen how a colony that seemed lost forever may have simply chosen adaptation over extinction. The colonists of Roanoke remind us that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in holding fast to what we know, but in embracing what we must become. They faced an impossible choice and chose to survive, to blend, to evolve. In doing so, they didn't disappear from history. They became part of something larger. And so, dear dreamer, as the echoes of history fade and the quiet of the night settles in, may your mind find peace and your dreams take you to places even time cannot touch. Until next time, sleep well and dream deeply.